The next item on your agenda is the in-year monitoring of public expenditure. Briefing from Assembly Research. Can I refer you to pages 98 through to 138 of your packs. And Colin, if you're ready, would you like to present the paper to the committee?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so I've already referred to this this paper in the closed session there, but this is just to allow the the committee to go through this paper in a bit more detail. The paper was basically prepared in order to support the rollout of these members' development workshops that we've been doing. It was really just to try and provide a sort of evidence base for what we were talking about during those sessions. So it's structured really. It looks at the purpose of in-year monitoring, which we have talked about earlier. It talks about the Assembly role. It looks at the scale of the reallocations. And then the main part of the paper is to report the study that we did. Within research, we wrote to all of the departments and asked for copies of all their bid documents from June 11-12 up to January 13-14. Excuse me. We got 200, more than 230 back. Can't remember exactly. 232 maybe. From all departments apart from DCAL. Now, they did subsequently provide them, but it was too late. So all the analysis here on the basis of the averages and so on are presented excluding DCAL. And the framework we used to look at these bid documents was the framework set out in DFP's monitoring guidelines. This requirement for the bids to be above the de minimis threshold, or if they're not above, to explain why they're not, what the exceptional reason is, why there's a below de minimis bid. The linkage with the programme for government, the requirement to talk about the equality or anti-poverty impacts of the bid, and also the prioritisation that is attached to them. So we went through each bid basically and categorised them. From this committee's perspective, I suppose the interest is maybe not so much on the individual bid, the one bid that DFP submitted, but more how the system as a whole operates in terms of managing the finances of Northern Ireland as a whole. And the guidelines do actually say that the Assembly looks to DFP to meet its expectations in a transparent, responsible and consistent fashion. So I suppose the question for me when I was looking at them is, does this process, as we can see it from the documents were given to us, do they meet that expectation? Is it transparent? Does it appear to be consistent? So that's really what the purpose of the study was, and whether the requirement of the guidelines was being met, because presumably there's a role then for this committee, if they're interested, to look into with DFP whether or not the guidelines are effective, or whether there's anything else they need to be doing. So to concentrate on the findings of the study. On the basis of the information that the departments provided to us, it's not clear that it's unclear that a bid that doesn't meet the requirements will not receive an allocation. That's a slightly complicated way of saying that if a bid doesn't comply with all the requirements of the guidelines, that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't receive money. Doesn't appear to be the case. For example, 79 bid documents that we looked at, so about a third of the total, didn't have anything in the box for the programme for government linkage. It didn't explain how the money they were looking for related to the delivery of a programme for government objective. Now, it may not in all cases be, there may not be a linkage, and there's no point making one up. But nevertheless, the guidelines state that there should be information there to say what the linkage is. And of those 79 which didn't have the information, 50 or 2/3 did receive an allocation. So that's really where I'm coming from when I say it's not clear that there's a relationship between complying with the guidelines and getting money. You know, that's the finding. Now, what we don't know within research is whether DFP would routinely go back to a department and say, you haven't filled this in. But I'll be honest, I would have expected, given we set out exactly what we were trying to do in this exercise, that had a form been returned to the department for extra work to be done on it, we would have been sent the amended version rather than the original one. Now, that's an assumption of mine, but there we are, you know. So I can't say categorically that there's not a bit of backwards and forwards then between the department and the finance officials afterwards. Moving on from the programme for government linkage, in terms of the equality and anti-poverty impacts, sorry, excuse me. On page 28 of the paper, there's a table which it sets out how we tried to categorise the information that's included in the bid document in relation to equality impacts in a particular way. So if it said it was not applicable or the box was blank, we counted it in one category. If the bid said none or no impact, we counted it separately, because there is a slight difference, to me anyway, there's a slight difference between saying not applicable and saying there is no impact. If you're saying it's not applicable, you're saying there are no considerations. But if you say none, then you're implying that there are no equality impacts, which is you know, subtly different, I suppose. We also counted separately those bids which said they were neutral, because again that implies that there has been an assessment conducted. And then finally we highlighted 18 bids which stated they had a positive impact for all, which is a misunderstanding of what an equality impact is, because an equality impact is a differential impact on a certain section of the society, so it's not sufficient to say everyone benefits from this. And the Equality Commission's guidance actually says that. Now, of the bids that we looked at, that table there on page 28, that adds up to 142, should do. Those are the ones where there was questionable or an absence of information or not much information. And then there were an additional, so of those, sorry, 90 of those bids received an allocation. And the information in some cases is of what we determine to be of poor quality, essentially. And I will give an example of that. There was a bid from Health for money to cover clinical negligence, and the bid form says investment in clinical negligence settlements should have a positive impact on statutory equality obligations for all. Now, I suppose there are two questions around that. The first one is around the use of the word investment. For me, investment is it's a word which has very positive connotations. You're spending money on something which you expect to see some sort of return on in the future. So on the basis of what's in the bid document, I don't know whether you can really genuinely classify clinical negligence payment as being an investment in anything. It's a compensation payment, as far as I understand it, for something that's gone wrong. And to suggest that it has a positive impact for all, again, across all equality groupings, again, to me, I can't say categorically that that's not the case, but if I were sitting on the committee and I saw something like that written in the bid document, I would be thinking, well, I want to challenge that, I want to question it. So there are, there's a mixture. Some of the documents aren't fully completed, some of them are completed, but the information, as I said, is maybe not of top-notch quality. There was another example, I think, from memory it was a DOE one. They were looking for money for tackling urban dereliction, and the equality box said the money would, it improves the look of the town centre, and therefore it makes it a nicer place to shop or whatever, which is probably the case, but it's not really relevant to an equality screening exercise, you know. So I don't want anyone to think I was just picking on health. You know, across the board there were good ones and weak ones. In relation to the prioritisation, which we talked about earlier, as I said earlier, when we were delivering these workshops initially, we were saying one of the things you really need to look at is the prioritisation. Is this right? Has the department prioritised their bid correctly? But then when you actually look at the relationship between the prioritisation and the allocation of money, it's not clear that actually there's an awful lot of value in doing so. If you look at figure 6, which is on page 31, that basically breaks down the value of each bid. So it's not the number of bids, but it's the amount of money of the bids in each priority category, and then charts the percentage of that value that was met with an allocation. So you can see of those bids which had no priority attached to them, in other words, the box was blank, nearly half of them, 47% of the value of those bids was met, which is actually higher than the 41% of the value of the bids that was met within the high priority category. So again, just looking at that information said to us, well, you know, what's the relationship there between the bid priority and actually receiving money? I mean, as I said earlier, ultimately the allocation of resources is a political decision. So, you know, what it says on the paper isn't important, but what's important is that is it a focus for committee scrutiny, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Yeah, so those bids which didn't have anything on, there was 22 of them, so around about 11, probably 10 of them did receive an allocation of resources. So taken together, I would suggest that these findings show that it's possible for a bid to be met with an allocation of resources, whether or not it complies with DFP's guidelines. That's the point. In turn, that suggests, in terms of what committees might do, or the Assembly how they might respond to that, is committees could be encouraging, for a start, could be encouraging departments to ensure that they comply with the guidelines. That would be one thing. So, asking departments to provide their bid documents and checking, do these comply with the guidelines or not? In turn, this should help with the idea of trying to mainstream equality screening, for example. I mean, all departments have a statutory obligation to screen any policies for equality impacts. So, again, that there's a legal requirement there. So, you know, it should be mainstreamed, in my view, into not in my view, really, it's in the view of the Equality Commission, I should say. And also in terms of committees could be looking at trying to increase the transparency of the money that's spent and the delivery of objectives, which I think was what you were talking about earlier. You know, how does that resource relate to what the executive has said its priorities are in terms of the programme for government objectives? And then secondly, I suppose for this committee particularly, the question is really, is the in-year monitoring process, is it meeting those tests of transparency, responsibility and consistency? And that's a question. It's not a question for me to answer. I suppose I'll provide what evidence I could find, but that's really a question then for the committee to put to the department, I suppose. So that's it. If there are any questions, Chair, I'll certainly take them.
Thank you, Colin. It's a very good piece of work, and I think it reflects perhaps what many committee members would have known or would have assumed in a way, that a lot of bids come through, and like you say, there's a lot of politics in terms of some of the decisions that are made, as opposed to adherence to the guidelines as outlined. And I suppose some of the questions that throws up is, you know, if the guidelines are there, why are they there, and should they be adhered to more closely? In terms of baselines, Colin, I mean, obviously we've made reference earlier to DRD. Is there any other departments where the baselines they receive are perhaps too low, or, you know, in terms of the monitoring rounds, is there trends emerging that show that there's bids being made that should actually be in the baselines of the department?
Well, I couldn't answer that from the basis of what we see. Really, all we were able to look at is how many bids are there. You know, the bid document, as you saw earlier, doesn't necessarily disclose what the baseline was. Now that I think maybe it would be helpful if it was, but for example, with DRD, they have raised an issue about the baseline for street lighting testing and repairs, and so there's been this heavy reliance on bidding. I don't recall having seen any of the other documents from any of the other departments that made a specific point about the baseline being too low, but that doesn't mean that, because that maybe wasn't what I was looking for. What I was looking for was just do these, or what we were looking for, sorry, was do these bids meet those criteria? So I wasn't necessarily testing it against what the baseline might be. I'm not sure how you would do that in any case.
And also, in terms of the forms that are attached to these bids, there's reference to equality, anti-poverty, and the programme for government. Mm-hmm. In terms of the programme for government, I mean, the PFG is, in many ways, quite a broad document. So if departments wanted to fit something in there, I'm sure they could anyway, with some fancy words, if you know what I mean. So how relevant is that criteria given that fact? Well,
I think that's quite a key point. There's no point just putting something in a box for the sake of putting something in a box and complying with guidelines. But I suppose, now without the programme for government in front of me, I can't remember, but DFP's commitments under the programme for government, I know one of them was to continue to work towards devolution of corporation tax. Now, I can't remember what the other ones were, but you know, that was one particular example that you could say, okay, well, if they needed additional money, they needed to commission research or whatever in relation to that objective, there's a clear linkage there. In other cases, they may be much more difficult to make a meaningful linkage. So I wouldn't be encouraging anyone to put in information. I mean, there's no point just waffling for the sake of it. But on the other hand, I think given that the guidance requires the linkage to be demonstrated, you would think that there would be an attempt made. I suppose that's what I would think.
In terms too of administration costs over the respective monitoring rounds, is there anything we should be concerned about, or in terms of administration costs, is there any significant rises within departments?
I didn't look in this paper at administration costs. It's on my, I have a little pad of paper on my desk with things I need to look at, and actually the administration cost is one that I was thinking that research should look at, but I was going to hold off until after October monitoring statements made. Then we've got to, you know, we're sort of up to date then, because they are disclosed in a separate table, and I think that information is something which could usefully be looked at. So yes, it's something that's sort of on our radar in terms of something to look at.
Okay, Paul.
Thank you, Colin. No, it's probably the only mechanism we have to actually deal with this process is through the monitoring round. And we appreciate you asked the question, but I think it is the only mechanism we have currently to actually deal with certain slippage that happens within budgets of within departments. But is there no mechanism to ensure that departments don't see their statutory running responsibilities and using monitoring rounds to actually do that? Now, anybody who, like myself, would see street lighting as a statutory function. The Department of Regional Development should be dealing with maintenance and ongoing on it, as opposed to actually relying upon monitoring rounds to deal with that. Why is it not included in their major or their main budget whenever they bid?
In that case, it should be. It should
Yeah.
really have been included. I think.
That's
I suppose the question, if you were sitting on the regional development committee in that case with the street lighting, the question might be: if you see these bids keep coming in for delivering this legal requirement, they have a legal obligation to test lights every however many, a sort of schedule of years. You would be saying, well, okay, even if your baseline was too low, how are you going to make sure that it's not too low next time around? Or what can you do? Are there any? Could you change the way you do it?
It's like
I don't. It's difficult to get into specifics of it.
I use what happened in DFP, where Land Property Services bid for an extra 5
It was 5 million.
5 million every year for a number of years until it was included within the overall function, because that was something that had to happen.
Yeah.
So when is that realisation? I appreciate we're at the end of a budgeting process, coming a few months away. What work is going on to ensure and appreciate that we don't end up with this coming forward again through monitoring in the following years?
Well, in terms of what's going on, I don't know. I can't answer. There's certainly, I'm not aware of any public announcement of any budget process having been commenced or anything. But I would expect there to be, that to be one of the things that departments are looking at, when they are preparing their submissions for any forthcoming budget process. They would be looking at, well, where have we had to bid repeatedly here? We've got a problem here that needs to be addressed. So we'll make a strong case for it. But beyond that, I can't speculate, I'm afraid.
Okay, members, any other questions? Not been enough. Okay, Colin. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members, can seek agreement to forward the research paper to DFP to respond to issues highlighted. Great. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, October monitoring round departmental position. Refer members to the department's briefing paper at pages 140 to 148 of your packs. Bishop and Peter, you're both very welcome. We'll make some opening comments before we go to questions.
Thank you, Chair. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, we've considered our position at this monitoring round particularly careful, and we're always mindful of the pressures that are being faced by the wider Northern Ireland public sector and that are being dealt with by the executive. However, where it comes to the equal pay liability, that is a matter that relates to staff who have worked across the Northern Ireland Civil Service and not just within DFP. So I thought it was important that should be recognised, and that's the reason why we've put that particular bid forward. We've also bid for depreciation, which can't be contained within our existing baseline. And I do understand that the block underspend in this area was around £18 million last year, and so that there's likely to be some funding available this year that can't be used for other priorities because it's ring-fenced. And so again, that probably gives you some feel for the logic behind that particular bid. My submission also reflects the fact that we've set aside £3.6 million to be surrendered at this monitoring round, and that's the amount that was indicated would be required as part of June monitoring to make up the level of overall reductions to the department to 4.4%. So that gives you sort of a bit of a brief overview of the paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much. Just in terms of the bid form that was given to the committee, why is it, first of all, that depreciation costs and also the inescapable pressure, they're both on one form, and also there doesn't seem to be any priority attached to it or any impact on statutory equality obligations and anti-poverty?
Okay,
And I presumed in terms of a legal case that might be applicable.
Okay, well, to be honest with you, we'd put it onto a single bid form simply for convenience for yourselves, so that you only had one piece of paper to look at. We will be aggregating it into 2 separate forms when we make our submission to supply, so there wasn't intended to be anything particularly sinister about that. I'm sure you can appreciate that there aren't really any equality implications of our depreciation bid. On the equal pay, I mean, again, we will be paying those amounts of money to the people that are legally entitled to them. So there aren't really any equality impacts associated with that. It's not, we won't be making a judgment as to the person's particular circumstances. If they're entitled to the payment, they will be getting it. And for that reason, we had assessed it as not having any equality impacts.
Was there any analysis made in terms of gender, the people we're talking about, whether they male or female, those kind of things? So there was no impact in terms
I mean, again, the people, it will be that the people who get it, who are legally entitled to it, will get it regardless of their gender. So, you know, it's not like we are looking at this and looking to see whether it's more favourable to men or to women in making the payment. If you're legally entitled to it, it will be made regardless of race, gender, or any of the other Section 75 groups.
Why is there no priority attached to it?
Again, we will need to prioritise these bids when we submit them to the centre, because one is for non-cash and one is for near cash. The priority will be, they'll both be the first priority in those particular categories. But they're both equally inescapable, so we'll need to make a judgment on that.
So they are inescapable, or
both of these are inescapable.
Are inescapable.
Yes.
Okay, in terms of the bid for 700,000 for the equal pay claims, it also states the department has been working to contact any remaining individuals who could potentially bring a claim. Given this as a cross-cutting issue arising from a legal obligation, is the bid therefore likely to be met? I mean, you were saying it's inescapable, so
I mean,
the presumption will be met.
I'm obviously conscious that the executive is experiencing severe financial pressures at the moment, and this payment will need to be made. But as a department, I suppose I wouldn't say that we have a high expectation given the amount of money that the executive will be in a position to meet it. And on that basis, we have got contingency plans in place as to what we will need to do in order to ensure that we can make the payment should that bid not be met. Because obviously it's a legal obligation and we would not put ourselves in the position where we can't make the payment to the people who are entitled to them.
And in terms of the potential claimants, what assurances can you give us that they've all been identified? And also, the committee has also raised issues concerning the PSNI-NIO grievance. Is there any need for the department to bid for resources to address those other equal pay issues?
Okay, taking those two things in turn, I understand from my colleagues in corporate HR that they have made contact with all of the people who are entitled using the latest address information that we had available to us, and that they have also made every effort they can to contact those people. Obviously, these are all people who've left the civil service, so once we have tried to contact them at their last known address, it becomes more difficult to locate them after that, but we are making every endeavour to get in touch with everybody who is entitled to one of these payments. On the second issue around the DOJ and PSNI, I understand there's a paper at the moment with the executive around that issue. Because it is a matter for the Department of Justice, any financial consequences would fall to be paid by that department, and therefore it would be for that department to bring forward a bid for the required resources should the executive take a decision to make payments in relation to that issue.
Could you elaborate too on the depreciation bid? Obviously, the 2.3 million refers to ESS. Why is it only associated with ESS rather than other parts of the department? Why is it only coming up now? It's not something that I've seen referred to before.
I mean, ESS is by far our largest capital spending business area. I mean, I think we traditionally would have a baseline of around about £20 million, and something like 17 or 18 million of that would be spent by ESS. So the vast majority of our depreciation requirement therefore lies within ESS. And we have been spending a good portion of money over the past few years in doing improvements to our office accommodation in particular, and that coupled with the fact that we're starting to see a recovery in the property market. We revalue our estate every year to market prices, which then has an impact on depreciation and increases it. So we have actually seen our depreciation rise from 31.7 million in 2011-12 to 33.9 million in 13-14. That was an increase of 2.2 million, and it's now increased again slightly in the current year. Last year we would have dealt with that by converting reduced requirements in year from near cash into depreciation. But as you'll appreciate, obviously this year our ability to do that has been limited by the reductions to the budget. So that's why we're bringing this bid forward.
So how long has this pressure been on your radar, so to speak?
It's been on our radar since, well, as I say, in 13-14, the depreciation was at a similar level to where we expect it to be this year. So we've known about it, but as I say, we've always planned to deal with it through in-year reclassifications, and I suppose that plan has been somewhat limited by the reductions that we're experiencing to the budget this year.
Okay, members, any questions? Just in terms of administration costs as well, in the June monitoring statement, admin costs for DFP increased by 3.4 million up to 155 million between the opening position in June, and DFP was only one of three departments, DFP, DSD and OFM DFM, to record an increase. What was the reason for the significant increase in admin costs, given the importance, as DFP would outline, of bearing down on these costs, given the financial circumstances that we're in?
There's two main reasons for that, Chair. The first one, if you'll recall, the Executive had approved our bid for the asset management strategy in June monitoring. So that was an additional £3.6 million of funding to enable us to establish a team within Central Procurement Directorate to take forward collaborative procurement with an aim in driving savings across the NICS in certain areas of procurement. And the second part of that was to resource the asset management team and to undertake surveys of property to enable us to identify the best way of taking forward the asset management strategy in terms of reducing the size of the estate and driving savings that way. So that 3.6 million has increased the department's admin costs initially, but it is designed to drive reductions in admin costs through better procurement and through reduced rent and rates and things like that, by reducing the footprint of the office estate. The second part of that will also have been, we had a transfer in June monitoring in relation to taking on additional services for DOJ, so onboarding the Department of Justice into Account NI. So again, our admin costs will increase, but we would have expected to see there would have been a reduction in the DOJ's admin costs at some point in the past to account for the fact that we're taking on that shared service on their behalf.
So when will we see a reduction in the DFP costs?
I would say very shortly, if the budget reductions keep going the way that they are.
Okay, members, happy enough? All right, thank you both very much.
Okay.
Moving on, members, to the next research paper on preventative expenditure. Can I refer you to pages 150 to 196 of your packs? Can I welcome Pamela Dugdale back to the committee again? Pamela, you want to present the paper and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. This briefing seeks to identify prevention and early intervention initiatives in Northern Ireland. It then examines initiatives in other jurisdictions and identifies lessons learned elsewhere to inform the committee's consideration of an inquiry in this area. We'll be able to take questions at the end. Prevention and early intervention, they're interconnected concepts which are used to describe a focus on tackling the root cause of social problems. This paper builds on information in a previous paper from May. It's in the following format. Section 1 provides baseline information for Northern Ireland and presents key findings of research in this area and discusses the Executive's Invest to Save initiative. Then Section 2 goes on to give comparative research findings. Firstly, international case studies and best practice, and then further reviews on preventative expenditure in other jurisdictions. And then finally, Section 3 goes on to some concluding remarks. Section 1. There have been a number of recent Assembly questions on preventative expenditure, and although the replies would indicate that ministers are broadly supportive of the principle, there would appear to be a lack of understanding. For example, 2 departments have stated that all their expenditure was preventative in nature. Therefore, it's likely that the Assembly would face similar problems to that experienced in Scotland, who have introduced a preventative strategy, where one minister commented that all agencies and departments claimed that everything they do is preventative. However, there has been progress in Northern Ireland. The National Children's Bureau has noted that early intervention was increasingly central to emerging policy in Northern Ireland. But they also state that it is critical that impacts of policy direction are measured across a range of outcomes. This is particularly important in Northern Ireland, where a lack of evidence has been noted as a barrier to the development of preventative approaches. In light of the complexities involved in the concept of early intervention and prevention, the committee may wish to request that DFP agreed a framework for evaluation and monitoring and assessment. I have given an indication of what type of framework on page 8 of the paper. The paper then goes on to highlight some current initiatives in Northern Ireland. There's the Time to Read initiative, which was introduced in 1999, which has shown a 9 percentile increase in reading rate. There's family support hubs, which were introduced in 2011 to help coordinate services for vulnerable families. The Research Service have been unable to identify any evaluations of these hubs. We did ask the Department of Health for some information, but it's not currently available. And when this information does become available, I will update you. There has been limited evaluative information on the operation of the schemes identified within the paper. I then went on to explore the Invest to Save initiative, which the Finance Minister has indicated may be able to fund preventative approaches. I requested information on the previous scheme for this paper in May, but due to work pressures, DFP were unable to provide the requested information in the time frame. So the committee may wish to seek that information. I did detail what all I'd inquired about within the paper. I did then, however, move on to publicly available information on the Invest to Save initiatives. The majority of these would appear to be voluntary redundancy schemes, as noted in the paper. And the schemes which I was able to identify would appear to have very little relevance to the type of preventative initiative identified elsewhere in the paper. Therefore, the committee may wish to request DFP review their original guidance on the Invest to Save initiative to ensure a more preventative focus before reissuing, perhaps. Section 2 of the paper then reviews good practice in relation to preventative initiatives. Initially, I looked at a couple of strategies that did not require government funding. These were in the area of stopping smoking. There was an increase in the price of tobacco, which was used very effectively in Greece, and also the ban on smoking in public places, which we have here. It's important to note that sometimes there's other good side effects to these things that one hasn't originally thought about. But another area that has been used effectively in England was in the area of school exclusions, where in 2011 a 4-year project was introduced where the budget assigned to local authorities was transferred to the schools themselves and put the impetus on schools to resolve their own problems, really. Another area is family interventions, things like family nurse partnerships, which has been pioneered in the US over 30 years ago. This has been introduced in the Western Health Trust in 2010 in Northern Ireland and has been expanded in 2012 across the whole of Northern Ireland. Functional family therapies is another initiative that was developed in the US over 30 years ago. The valuation on this particular scheme estimates that for every £1 invested, over £10 of benefits actually accrue. The section then goes on to provide some details of preventative initiatives and their funding and implementation in the US, England and Australia. The US introduced a national prevention strategy for health in 2011. It has assigned between 2010 and 2022 an $18.75 billion fund to that. However, there have been some criticisms because of the vague spending mandate and the allocation of the funding through this particular scheme. And England has also been making moves towards a preventative approach. They initiated a review by Graham Allen in 2010 to appraise evidence in favour of early intervention and to look at funding of those types of schemes. Out of this particular initiative or area, there's been 2 initiatives brought forward in England. The £20 million Social Outcomes Fund, which was launched in November 2012, which adopts an outcomes-based approach like payments by results or social impact bonds. Some more details on social impact bonds are included in the appendix to the paper. These projects are required to assess and report performance as a prior condition of funding. There's also the Early Intervention Foundation, which was set up in July 2013 to assess evidence of what works, to analyse evidence, and advise others, and to advocate for early intervention. The Early Intervention Foundation aims to improve the UK evidence base for early intervention, which assists in the rollout further of these type of schemes. And then finally, Australia, where preventative health has been a key policy area since 2007. The government itself sets health priorities on a national level, and then state and territory governments deliver the health services. In 2012, 5 years after the initial policy move, a health survey in Australia reported a 9% increase in the population that reported excellent or very good health. However, there are some criticisms levelled at this task force whereby the criticisms relate to benefits being overstated and costs ignored. maybe not a great thing in this straitened circumstances. So in conclusion, it's important to target limited resources in the most cost-effective manner possible. The evaluation of prevention schemes is essential for successful implementation and scaling up for wider impact. To help the committee determine whether appropriate controls are in place around a preventative strategy, Research are happy to review any DFP information on the controls and monitoring arrangements once it is available and brief the committee. Accordingly, this should hopefully provide assurance to the committee on value for money for the taxpayer.
Thank you, Pamela.
Okay.
I suppose a key issue that sticks out for me is the fact that a number of departments don't grasp it, or maybe don't want to grasp what preventative spending is. Like you say, some of the departments are referring to all their spending as preventative. So how do we tackle that, or what's your own assessment of departments across the board and how educated they are in terms of preventative spend?
Well, I think, and this is what has come out from Scotland as well, the key thing is to tie down exactly what is meant by preventative expenditure. And once there's a good definition in place, then you can apply it to, to the spending priorities or whatever. But it has to be, Scotland have identified that their particular definition was too wide. It needs to be a concentrated, focused definition before moving any further. And then it sort of focuses the mind for ministers and for departments on what exactly the executive is hoping to do with this money and what success would look like.
Mm-hmm. And is there many examples of how economically beneficial this could be? I mean, obviously, there's a good reference there to Greece in terms of £500 million being generated by extra taxation on cigarettes. Is there many examples of that there? Because I think that might be a better way to sell it to some than others.
Well, there's also in the appendix, there's also mention of the Peterborough prison, which has shown some early success, and the amount of money that's saved by offenders not reoffending, by people not reoffending. And it's difficult to know. There are a number of examples on preventative expenditure, but they tend to be longer term in nature, and in some cases the need to, what could you say? The fact that people are very keen on this as an initiative sometimes blurs the lines, and although they get one outcome, that wasn't really what they'd expect to begin with, but they will state at the end that there is success, that it is a success because this particular outcome has been reached. So I think in one way it would be useful, and that's what I suggested in the framework, is to tie down exactly what could be viewed as a success at the beginning, before it actually takes place, to tie down the people actually advocating for this initiative, to tie down what they see as a success before it's funded, and then go back after the initiative has ended to say, well, did it reach these particular outcomes? Did these actually happen? And if not, what else did it? What else was accomplished? And it may be that initially it becomes more of an iterative process, because that's the only way to build up the evidence base. Not everything will be a success, But it's important to know at the outset what you're aiming for, and then at least start off in that direction. You may be diverted at some point, but at least you know your path, what you see as your outcome.
Okay, Paul?
Thank you very much. No, thank you. It's just, there's no saying, a stitch in time saves nine. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily see that being an idea that government buy into. And I think maybe even just not looking at social aspects, but I'm looking at possibly even from a road maintenance point of view. You know, they leave it until it's too late and they have to resurface a whole road before doing preventative maintenance. But that's by the way. No, I'm more interested to find out about what work has been done to identify where cross-departmental work is going on, and I think not necessarily only to do with government. I think of investing in maybe a programme to people waiting lists for hip replacement. Just use that as an example. By the time they get their hip replacement, they have been off work that long that they've lost their job. They're then dependent upon benefits. Then by the time the operation is completed, they're at a point where convalescing, it's not worthwhile. So they stay and they remain on benefits. And as a consequence, because that's AME fund, it doesn't particularly matter to anybody, but they don't realise that that person is no longer contributing to the society. Other areas of Europe have adopted a totally different scenario where they ensure that people who have an illness which is not necessarily going to be debilitating to them get through the system quickly so as they get back to actually earning money and working, and they don't lose their job and they don't become dependent. And if they fail to meet those targets, the Department of Health within certain European countries end up having to pay the full wage for that person. So it focuses me. That is what I call a preventative spending. You're actually spending some money, yes, initially up front, priming the pump to make sure it doesn't happen. Is there an indication of looking at the bigger picture and ensuring that we don't just look in silos? Because that seems to be the way everything works. Not even just within a department, and I'm talking about one department. You have people within certain departments because that's their budget. Forget about what the other people are doing. Is there that cross-looking, interdepartmental, and also within departments of themselves? Because certain people have. I don't want to actually take on that because that's somebody else's budget within even the same body.
I think there is a history of silo budgeting in Northern Ireland and across the UK. I think there's a history of silo budgeting, and in my previous paper I had noted that in order to fully address any type of preventative strategy, that silo budgets would need to be addressed, that departments would have to get together and agree how to fund particular areas and who takes the risks and who takes the rewards. That there is equal benefits or disadvantages to both. Because there has one initiative I did look at in Scotland. I think it was in Glasgow, whereby it was to do with crime, and although the beneficiary were the police, they agreed that any savings that they had made would go back into the initiative itself, because they felt that it was wrong for them to reap the rewards when they hadn't expended, any resources in reaching those rewards. And I think there has to be a more open discussion around it within the various different departments, because, as you say, risks and rewards have to be shared.
You alluded to one example, which I think was in the United States, where for every £1, say, spent
Yes.
this area, there had been a £10 saving or something along, an equivalent of maybe
Yes.
How is that evaluated? You know, do they have a model which actually demonstrates that? Because you can't be sure, well, that person, they didn't offend because we did such and such. You can never, you've no way of knowing if that ever happened, you know, because it was an incident that wasn't there.
Well, in some ways, it is very difficult to evaluate something that doesn't happen. But America is much more developed in their evaluation of these type of things than we would be. But what they do is they look at the national average or the average in that area beforehand and see what would be the impact. For instance, in the social income bond in Peterborough, they have, in order to evaluate how successful Peterborough has been, the Peterborough Jail Project, they have, at the outset, they have nominated a number of other prisons with similar reoffending rates, so that as controls, so that they can look at those and go, well, Peterborough had the same at the beginning of this initiative. At the end of this initiative, where are the control jail and where are Peterborough, so that you can say, well, you can't say definitely all those people would not have offended because of the Peterborough initiative, but the likelihood is that if the circumstances were similar beforehand, there would likely be, if there wasn't an intervention, it would be similar after. And that's it's difficult to know, and I wouldn't say it's an exact science by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that's the only way you could evaluate it.
Appreciate that, thank you.
Okay, Kayla?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for your presentation. I suppose, and just coming on the back of what Paul has said, I think we're sitting here with our EAC hats on us and we're talking about protecting the public purse, and that's what it's about. And I suppose when you do that, you should be thinking along the lines that there should be more preventative measures in place as opposed to early interventions, obviously, because the long-term outcomes of that would be better. But it's just to make the comment, basically in terms of that, there would be more examples of early intervention in terms of cross-departmentals than there would be preventative programmes.
I don't know. I would have maybe went the other way, because I think early intervention has a poor press, because you know, instead of, because early intervention sometimes it's not necessarily that you can stop something happening. One example that was used in the literature was that someone becomes depressed because there's been a death in the family. Now, you can't prevent death happening in a family, but an early intervention is where you would come in at an earlier stage and hopefully stop, you know, the bad circumstances, you know, and the major depression, you know, maybe just get it and nip it in the bud, rather than, you know, the guy becoming suicidal, or, you know, not being able to contribute to society or whatever. You know, prevention and early intervention are very interconnected, and it's not that one is better than the other. It is just that they're interconnected, but there
needs more work done.
They need more work. They need more work. But early intervention isn't necessarily that something really bad has happened, but it can be that you can see something that really bad can happen, and you can just
in terms of a community, maybe in terms
Uh-huh.
of suicide or something like that, you can kind of reduce the figures.
You can maybe sort of put something in place that the bad result doesn't eventually happen. That you're never going to stop bad things happening. You're never going to stop a death in the family and somebody getting depressed. That's just impossible. But you can intervene at an early time and hopefully stop the really bad repercussions. And I think maybe early intervention, you know, is seen as not tackling it in time. But it can just be, sort of, as I said, nipping it in the bud. Bad things happen to good people all the time, and sometimes we have to look at how we can address that, in a hopefully a effective manner, as effective manner as possible. But there are a number of preventative initiatives, as can be seen from the paper, like Time to Read. But a lot of them, it takes a long time to evaluate them. For instance, Time to Read, it was in place for almost 10 years before there was quantitative analysis done to say whether it was doing what it was purported to be doing. There was a lot of just qualitative comments, people saying, yes, this is doing what it needs to. But I think a lot of us, especially in PAC and everything else, we like to see the numbers. And as an accountant, I like to see the numbers.
Chair, just on that, and I know we're talking about the budget, but in your paper, you talk about the family support hubs.
Mm-hmm.
I think is it 15 out of the 23 have now been developed.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know what the time frame for developing the whole 23 was? It's just for information. That's all. It's not.
If I don't know off the top of my head, but I can certainly come back to you and let you know.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, John.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. It's, I suppose, one of those things you mentioned about, both sort of early detection and preventative spend. I think it's one of those things that we always have talked about, and ever since I was elected here in 07, we've talked about that. It served a long time in the Health Committee, and we talked particularly there about preventative spend and what this could do, early intervention, and even trying to build flourishing mental health, and the impact that could have even right throughout not only health but criminal justice, education, economic activity of individuals. But we've never really grasped how we pull all that together and make it happen. And certainly when you get to a time like now where budgets are coming under huge pressure, these type of things tend to be like the softer end. Yes, we would love to do that, but they're almost the first to go. And I think one of the figures we got from someone in this committee, I think it was in this committee, was something almost, if you really went full throttle at this, you could almost wipe about 40% of your spend out, which means an incredible figure given, we're struggling maybe to do 4 or 5% cuts, never mind take 40% out. So, and then you tie into that our particularly system of government leaves it very, very difficult. It almost encourages and institutionalises the silo mentality even more profoundly, say, than some other. There's probably always a sense of silo mentality, whatever your model of governance. But the big challenge, and I'm not sure we've ever come anywhere near financial this, is how do you break that down, and how do you convince each department and each almost accounting officer for every department that this is actually the place that we should be aiming at, and if we have to make cuts, it shouldn't be here.
Luckily, that isn't for me to say how that's going to happen.
That's maybe just my run.
However, from the Minister of Finance's particular, a statement recently, he has suggested that Invest to Save could be used to fund particular areas on preventative and early intervention, and it may be that if the department ensured how the paperwork goes out, to actually ask for bids, if the committee looked at that information and sort of made sure that they were happy of how the preventative focus was detailed within that paper, because up to now, anything, the information that I was able to get on InvestToSave was mostly around voluntary redundancies. That was in health, that was in a number of areas, and perhaps you just need to tie that down a wee bit. You know, what you as a committee consider preventative expenditure to be, and how you would like that to be reflected for the funding of it through the InvestToSave initiative, because it's, I presume that departments would be able to get together to request funding under that. It's over and above, it would be over and above their departmental budgets, so it would be outside the normal areas. So I think maybe just sort of look at that and how it is described, and what sort of schemes would get a tick in the box and get funding under it.
Using what the DFP minister said, using InvestToSave as a pot of money that you could get to almost encourage more cross-departmental working, so health and justice could buy into a certain programme, health and education maybe into something else, or indeed maybe 3 or 4.
But it would depend on how the request for bids, for want of a better term, under InvestToSave would be phrased, and how it would, you know, how DFP views those requests for funding, and how it control. You know, is there going to be a framework of outcomes that are needed before requesting that money, or is it just going to be a more laissez-faire system? You know, I don't know. I did ask for information on the previous scheme and how, if it was evaluated or anything else, as you can see, but that information at the present time has not been forthcoming. So I don't know what the information was, you know, how it was initially rolled out to the departments, what sort of bids, you know, the information was required on the bids or anything else. So it's difficult to know, but certainly if there's a new initiative coming out, it would be worthwhile, you know, putting those controls in place now rather than after the horse is out through the door.
Okay, John. Okay, members? All content? Right, Pamela? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, members, certainly something we will return to, and also can I seek agreement to forward the research paper to the department to respond to the issues that are highlighted. Agreed?
Great.
Moving on to correspondence.
As Chair, there's 3 items of correspondence. First item is correspondence from the ETI Committee regarding alternative dispute resolution for consumer disputes. It's correspondence has gone from that committee to DFP, so it's just for this committee to note. Correspondence in table papers from a member of the public regarding the Presbyterian Mutual Society. The committee previously agreed to refer similar correspondence to the ETI Committee because the issue falls with that department, Chair. So if the committee's content, the item can be referred to the ETI Committee and the letter issued to the correspondent reflecting that action. Members happy?
Great.
And then finally, there's a newsletter has been prepared by the Assembly Secretariat's EU Affairs Manager, Sean McGeehan, and it's just on a trial basis, and that's at page 229 of the pack. So there's members' feedback is sought before a decision is made on whether to proceed with a regular publication of this sort. So if members can just maybe feedback any comments directly to Sean McGeehan, if they get an opportunity to consider that at some stage. Okay. That's all the correspondence, Chair.
Okay, members. Moving on to committee work programme, pages 235 and 238. Members' content? Yeah. Yep. Agreed. Any other business? No. Next meeting then will be 8th October, 10 a.m.
The Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.